Greetings. This video covers fluid electrolyte and acid-base balance. It is part 1 of 2. When we look at the constituents that make up our body, we are made up of water, and the percentage of water within our bodies and within our tissues varies greatly depending on the source. Some resources will say that the body mass of infants is roughly 73% water. For adults, it's anywhere between 50 and 60%, with men being higher. As people get older, they tend to not drink enough water, and so they tend to be more dehydrated. So with elderly individuals, we may see a water content of approximately 45%. Adipose connective tissue is the least hydrated at anywhere between 10 and 20% water, and skeletal muscle is considered the highest percentage of water content of all the tissues at approximately 75%. Now, remember that when minerals dissolve in water and are dissociated from one another, that creates ions, and ions in water are referred to as electrolytes. So solute balance or electrolyte balance determines the movement of water due to osmosis. Remember, water follows solute and will always move from an area of a high ratio of water content to a lower ratio of water content. So it's going down its own concentration gradient, or we could say with its own concentration gradient, from an area of high water to an area of lower water in terms of ratio water compared to solute. So an appropriate balance of water and solute has to be maintained in order for our bodies to function properly. The fluid within our body is compartmentalized by physical barriers. Approximately 40% of our total body weight is made up of what we refer to as intracellular fluid. Intra means within. That's the fluid within the cells and makes up the main component of cytoplasm. 20% of our body weight is found in extracellular fluid, which is fluid that surrounds all cells. This includes the fluid component of blood that we call plasma. You'll recall that plasma is important in transporting blood cells, proteins, electrolytes, as well as nutrients, gas, and waste. Extracellular fluid is also found as interstitial fluid. That's the fluid that surrounds all cells that are not in the bloodstream. We also have other body fluids, including cerebrospinal fluid, lymphatic fluid, synovial fluid, serous fluid, and aqueous humor, which is the fluid inside the eye. I just noticed that we didn't include in this list gastrointestinal fluids. They would also be part of that. If we look at this graph of body fluid composition, you'll notice that there are different solutes at the bottom of the graph, such as sodium, chloride, bicarbonate, potassium, phosphate, calcium, magnesium, and protein, in that order. And those are measured in concentrations of milliequivalents per liter. If we look at the comparisons of intracellular fluid on the far left of each solute, the far left bar, versus interstitial fluid, which is part of extracellular fluid, in the middle, and then plasma on the far right of each solute, which is also part of the extracellular fluid, what we see is that plasma has high concentrations of sodium, chloride, bicarbonate, and protein, and interstitial fluid has high concentrations of sodium, chloride, and bicarbonate, but not protein. On the other hand, intracellular fluid, the stuff inside the cells, has the highest concentrations of potassium, phosphate, protein, and magnesium. Now, you should remember that sodium and chloride are concentrated in extracellular fluid, and potassium ions are concentrated inside the cells. Remember that that's what helps to create a difference in voltage across the membrane that causes a membrane potential. And this also helps to tie water volume because the body's volume of water is closely tied to sodium ions. Where salt goes, water tends to follow. There are other ions that will attract water, but the water volume is very, very closely tied to sodium ions. On the top right of this slide, you'll see the sodium-potassium pump. Remember that pump works 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to maintain higher levels of sodium in extracellular fluid and higher concentrations of potassium inside the cell. Before I discuss this slide, I just wanted to remember that when you see ECF, that's discussing extracellular fluid. Extracellular fluid is fluid outside the cells and includes interstitial fluid, includes blood plasma. Interstitial fluid on this slide is going to be abbreviated by IF. Intracellular fluid is going to be abbreviated as ICF. So let's see how fluid moves between these compartments. Remember that osmotic pressure is pressure generated by solutes, including proteins and electrolytes, whereas hydrostatic pressure is fluid pressure, and usually we refer to hydrostatic pressure as fluid pressure in blood vessels like capillaries or perhaps in arterioles or venules. It's just usually pressure from blood in blood vessels. So, because of osmotic and hydrostatic pressures existing in the body, those pressures help to regulate a continuous exchange and mixing of fluid. Water freely moves according to osmotic gradients and according to pressures. All body fluid osmolarity is almost always equal. However, if there's a change in solute concentration in any compartment, that can lead to a net flow of water in a specific direction. For instance, if there is an increase in the osmolality, so the solute concentration in the extracellular fluid outside the cells, that means that the water that's inside the cells is going to leave to go outside the cell, and that actually also triggers thirst. So if a person's solute concentration outside the cells increases, then the water is going to move from the cell outside the cell, and again, that's going to trigger our thirst mechanism because we have osmoreceptors which detect changes in osmolality. If we have a decrease in extracellular osmolality, that means that there's a greater concentration of water outside the cells, and that means that water is going to go into the cells. Now, there are also exchanges that can occur between blood plasma and interstitial fluid across capillary walls. We know that fluid is going to leak out because of capillary hydrostatic pressure as blood moves through the arteriolar end of a capillary, and it can be reabsorbed. Some of that will be reabsorbed at the venule end, and any fluid that occurs as a net movement out of the capillaries that does not get reabsorbed will be picked up by the lymphatic system, which will eventually return that fluid back into the bloodstream. So the changes or the exchanges that occur between interstitial fluid and intracellular fluid will occur across the cell membrane. So there's a two-way osmotic flow of water, and ions can move selectively in or out of the cell by way of channels in the cell membranes and pumps. Now, nutrients, gases, wastes have a unidirectional flow, so they only go in one direction, but other things like water and ions can move in or out of the cell. If fluid balance gets out of balance, that's when we see edema. So if there's excess water in tissues, especially in the extremities, that could be caused by leaky capillaries or even therapeutic drugs that can cause an increase in capillary permeability. Pregnancy, where a woman has more body fluid to support not only her but this growing baby inside of her. Injury, allergy, that can cause excessive leaking out of capillaries that may cause edema to occur. Liver damage can also cause this, because if the liver can't produce enough plasma proteins, remember we have albumin, globulin, fibrinogen dissolved in plasma, then that could lead to fluid leaking out of capillaries causing edema. Pitting edema usually means that there is a systemic problem and often presents in extremities due to gravity pulling that excessive fluid into the extremities. And here we see a really extreme case of pitting edema in the feet. Now, excess fluid in the lungs can lead to pulmonary edema, where there is an accumulation of fluid in the alveoli, which you can see in this lower right-hand picture, where the alveoli are actually accumulating fluid. And that could be due to things like heart failure, kidney failure, pneumonia, medications, high altitude trauma. Could be due to pulmonary hypertension as well. I don't think I mentioned that in this list, but that's another thing. And when that occurs, that compromises the exchange of gas that can occur in the alveoli. And this can also lead to blood congestion, pulmonary blood congestion, that is due to a backup of blood flow that can now cause damage of pulmonary capillaries. So usually when things go wrong, it affects other systems. So if we have pulmonary edema, that's going to cause a backup of blood flow in the lungs, which can go back to the heart. When we talk about water regulation, there's an exchange of fluid every day that occurs with our body that's roughly 2.5 liters a day. And our water intake is mostly going to occur by what we drink and what we eat. So approximately 2.25 liters is ingested with food and beverage, and then the remaining 10% is going to be produced by what we call water of oxidation or metabolic water, where water is actually produced by cellular metabolism. So that's how we get water in our bodies, and then water leaves our body by predominantly urine. So the percentage of fluid we drink is usually the equivalent to what is put out. So we drink roughly 1.5 liters per day and excrete 1.5 liters of urine per day. But then we also lose water from our bodies through what's referred to as insensible water loss, through the skin and the lungs, through sweat, and also in feces. You've heard me refer to the term osmolality as well as the term osmolarity. What's the difference? Osmolarity is simply defined as the number of solute particles per liter of solvent. That's osmolarity. Osmolality is measured as the number of solute particles per kilogram of solvent. In the human body, osmolality is maintained somewhere between 280 and 300 milliosmoles. When we look at how we regulate our intake of water, understand that our thirst mechanism is the main driving force for regulating water intake. And when we look at plasma osmolality, that's the solute particles per kilogram of plasma, that tells us the ratio of solutes to water in blood plasma that is normally measured by osmoreceptors and reflects the state of hydration in an individual. If there is a rise in osmolality, that means there's more solute particles. That's going to stimulate thirst. It's also going to cause the neurohypophysis to release antidiuretic hormone, and the hypothalamus will also decrease salivary output. A decrease in osmolality will cause inhibition of thirst and will cause the release of antidiuretic hormone from the neurohypophysis. So those are mechanisms that help us regulate how much water we take in. In terms of regulating water output, obligatory water losses explain why we can't live without water for very long. On average, it's about 3 days, and that depends on a lot of different factors. The very, very young and the very, very old tend to dehydrate much more quickly. The person's status of his health would play a factor in that. The environment, there are a lot of things that can contribute to that. And when we talk about obligatory water losses, remember that includes both insensible water loss that we can't tell is going on. That's why it's insensible. We cannot sense the loss. And that usually occurs from the lungs or the skin. And sensible water loss, such as urine, in which we excrete waste products. So about 60% of our sensible water loss occurs in urine alone. And then there's obvious sweat and feces. So the volume of urine excreted and the solute concentration within urine are going to depend on fluid intake, on diet, and on water loss by other avenues. The volume of urine that we excrete on a daily basis must not be less than 0.47 liters per day in order to get rid of the waste products that we produce. So that's about ½ liter. The term diuresis refers to an increased or excessive production of urine. And as you recall, antidiuretic hormone is stored and secreted by the neurohypophysis. That's a water-conserving hormone that controls the amount of water reabsorbed from the collecting ducts in the kidneys. Antidiuretic hormone can also constrict peripheral arterioles and moves aquaporins into cell membranes to increase the permeability of the collecting tubules. So if we look at this picture on this particular slide, we can see at the very top in the first cell there is a vesicle that acts as an aquaporin storage vesicle, and that can actually move to the surface of the lumen of the collecting tubule in the kidneys to allow water to go through the cell, as well as to the opposite surface where the aquaporins will be close to the bloodstream again, so water can pass right through those cells that line the tubules in the kidneys. And depending on how much antidiuretic hormone is available, that could increase the number of aquaporins that are inserted on the lumen of the surface of the cells that face the collecting tubules. And the collecting tubules, as you recall, those are the last tubules where urine travels prior to going into the minor calyces and then the major calyces and then into the renal pelvis. So aquaporins can be inserted into the cell membranes to increase the flow of water out of the collecting tubules or collecting ducts and going back into the bloodstream so that we can reabsorb more water before it's peed out in the form of urine. Usually when we talk about electrolyte balance, what we really mean is salt balance, even though there's lots of other electrolytes in our body, including things like potassium and chloride, bicarbonate, calcium, phosphate, acids, bases, and some proteins. Salts control fluid movement throughout our body. They also provide minerals for excitability, neuromuscular secretory activity, and membrane permeability. Salts can get into us by way of ingestion, metabolism, and are lost by way of perspiration, fecal material, urine, and vomit. Sodium is the most abundant cation in extracellular fluid, and it's primarily regulated by aldosterone. Regulation of sodium is very closely linked to blood pressure. Sodium is the only cation that exerts significant osmotic pressure. Remember, it controls extracellular fluid volume and water distribution because water follows salt. Changes in sodium levels can affect plasma volume, blood pressure, extracellular fluid, and interstitial fluid volumes. Eating salty foods will cause a temporary increase in blood pressure. When we talk about hyponatremia, that means that there are low sodium levels in blood, and it's usually due to excess water accumulation. Hypernatremia means that there is an abnormal increase in blood sodium levels. We know that the major cation in extracellular fluid is going to be sodium. However, the major cation inside the cells is potassium. And potassium helps establish membrane potential, which is the electrical voltage differential from the outside of the plasma membrane to the inside of the plasma membrane when the number of cations from one side is compared to the other. And we know that aldosterone will help us reabsorb sodium, in which case water will follow. What we haven't discussed yet is the fact that aldosterone also causes the secretion of potassium. And in the case of hypokalemia, hypokalemia is a condition of low blood potassium levels that can lead to things like weakness, fatigue, dizziness. In severe cases, it can cause paralysis or respiratory failure. So low levels or low distribution of potassium could be caused by things like starvation, diarrhea, alkalosis. On the other hand, hyperkalemia is when we have high potassium levels due to acidosis or increased intake of potassium, And when we have hyperkalemia, that means that cells can't repolarize. That can cause the heart muscle to stop contracting. It can also lead to things like mental confusion, numbness, weakened respiratory function. So on the right side of this picture, you can see if there's increased potassium concentration in extracellular fluid. Remember, it should be on the inside of the cells, not the outside. But if we've got too much, that can also stimulate the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, which will target the kidney tubules, causing increased potassium secretion, restoring plasma levels of potassium. And remember that as that happens, aldosterone is also going to cause increased sodium reabsorption so that we can reabsorb water at the same time. You'll remember from AMP1 that when salts, like sodium chloride, are placed in water, which is what most of our body is made of, they dissociate into ions, which we refer to as electrolytes. Sodium is a positively charged cation, and the major anion in extracellular fluid is going to be chloride. Chloride is that negatively charged anion that accompanies sodium. And chloride can also help maintain osmotic pressure in the bloodstream. It can balance cations because when blood pH falls, less chloride is going to be reabsorbed by the kidneys to allow for bicarbonate reabsorption. Notice how they are both negatively charged anions. If things get out of whack and there's too much chloride in the bloodstream, that's a condition that we call hyperchloremia. It can arise from different causes like renal tubular acidosis, excessive vomiting, diarrhea, kidney disease, diuretics. Those can all lead to metabolic acidosis if there's too much chloride in the blood, because what's going to happen is that chloride can combine with hydrogen ions in the stomach to form more hydrochloric acid. And it can also inhibit the level of enzymes involved in the excretion of hydrogen ions by the kidneys. So now there's more hydrogen ions. Chloride ions can displace other anions that help to buffer acids. So too much chloride is not a good thing. It can lead to metabolic acidosis. Hypochloremia is considered much more rare and can also occur through vomiting, diarrhea, sweat, use of diuretics. And the symptoms for hypochloremia are going to include things like dizziness, fatigue, muscle weakness, difficulty breathing, and changes in blood pressure. When we look at the balance of bicarbonate, remember that chloride is the most abundant anion in extracellular fluid. Bicarbonate is the second most abundant anion. And bicarbonate is really important in maintaining acid-base balance because bicarbonate can be used to soak up excess hydrogen ions. And when it combines with excess free hydrogen ions, it makes a weak acid known as carbonic acid. So again, bicarbonate's going to maintain acid-base balance. We know that in highly metabolic tissues, a lot of carbon dioxide will be produced because metabolic tissues require lots of adenosine triphosphate, and one of the metabolic byproducts or waste products of producing adenosine triphosphate is carbon dioxide. So as our cells, our highly metabolic cells, produce carbon dioxide, that carbon dioxide diffuses from the cells and goes through the interstitial fluid into the bloodstream, and only a small amount of the carbon dioxide will be dissolved in blood plasma. Most of it is going to be converted by erythrocytes to carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will further dissociate into bicarbonate, and the bicarbonate is going to travel in blood plasma. So if we look at the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system in the bicarbonate reserve, you can see that those different chemical reactions are reversible, and they get driven in one direction or the other depending on where there are more of a specific type of molecule. So if we've got a lot of carbon dioxide and water, if you look on the left-hand side of the bottom picture, that carbon dioxide and water will react to form carbonic acid, which can further dissociate into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions, and then the bicarbonate ions can join together with sodium to form sodium bicarbonate, which forms a bicarbonate reserve that can be used in the presence of excess hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, which can then be broken down into carbon dioxide and water. So again, these chemical reactions are going to be driven by concentration gradients that are created by the metabolic activity of our cells. The more carbon dioxide that's produced, the more carbonic acid that's produced, and again, that can be broken down into hydrogen and bicarbonate. The bicarbonate can be stored as sodium bicarbonate. The hydrogen ions can be excreted by the kidneys. So there's lots of different ways that these chemical reactions can be driven, and this is just one small picture in many. Most of the calcium in our body is stored in bones and teeth in the form of a molecule called hydroxyapatite, which is a combination of calcium, phosphate groups, oxygen, and hydrogen. Hydroxyapatite provides hardness for bones and teeth. Remember that collagen makes bones strong, but minerals make bone hard. Bone serves as a reserve for other body tissues that require calcium. And if blood levels of calcium fall, remember that the parathyroid glands will detect those decreased levels of calcium in the blood, and they will secrete parathyroid hormone. When parathyroid hormone is secreted, 98% of the calcium that's filtered into potential urine will be reabsorbed by the kidneys. That's how strong parathyroid hormone action is on the kidneys. Parathyroid hormone does this because it stimulates osteoclast activity in bone tissue, causing the release of hydroxyapatite in a form that's broken down into calcium and phosphate. The calcium, as we mentioned, will be reabsorbed by the kidneys, where the phosphate will actually be excreted in urine. And not only does parathyroid hormone stimulate osteoclasts, cause increased reabsorption of calcium by the kidneys, it also helps convert vitamin D into its active form to increase calcium absorption from food in our small intestines. And all of those actions combined help to raise blood levels of calcium. About half of the calcium that circulates in our blood is bound to proteins, and the other half is simply circulating as a cation. And the reason we need specific levels of calcium in our blood is because calcium is important for blood clotting. It also helps with cell membrane permeability. It's involved in secretory activities and neuromuscular excitability, in which it plays its most important role. Again, calcium is best absorbed with active vitamin D. It's very strictly regulated with parathyroid hormone. In the event that there is not enough calcium in the blood, that's a condition known as hypocalcemia, which will lead to an increase in neuromuscular excitability. That can lead to muscle tetany, where the muscle has a fully sustained contraction with no relaxation. Hypercalcemia, on the opposite spectrum, inhibits neurons and muscle cells and can lead to arrhythmias of the heart. We discussed how hydroxyapatite in bones and teeth is a combination of calcium and phosphate groups. So approximately 85% of phosphorus in the human body is going to be found in bones and teeth. And the other 15% is going to be distributed in soft tissues, cells throughout the body, in phospholipids, in adenosine triphosphate, nucleotides, buffers. And when blood gets filtered through the kidneys and we've got that filtrate, that's potential urine, 75% of the phosphates that get filtered are going to be reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule by way of secondary active transport, and the remaining 25% would normally be flushed in urine. However, in the presence of parathyroid hormone, remember parathyroid hormone, we want to break down hydroxyapatite in bone. We need the calcium, but we don't need the excess phosphorus. So parathyroid hormone actually inhibits the reabsorption of phosphates by decreasing the transport maximum in the proximal convoluted tubule. So less phosphate is reabsorbed by the proximal convoluted tubule in the presence of parathyroid hormone. Phosphate reabsorption is also affected by insulin, which increases the reabsorption of phosphate, as well as glucagon, which decreases the reabsorption of phosphate back into the bloodstream. In conditions of hypophosphatemia, that's usually caused by diabetic ketoacidosis, alcohol abuse, burns, malnutrition, where the individual experiences things like muscle weakness, bone pain, seizures, and even coma. Hyperphosphatemia is usually due to kidney disease and can cause calcification of blood vessels as well as bone mineralization disorders. We know that aldosterone helps to regulate both sodium and potassium. We saw this picture on the left before, how when body sodium concentration decreases, that triggers the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, where we increase the reabsorption of sodium and increase potassium secretion. So we hold on to sodium, water follows, we get rid of potassium, and we're basically exchanging cation for cation in that process. And in the kidneys, remember that the macula densa monitors osmolality. So increased levels of potassium can directly stimulate the zona glomerulosa to secrete aldosterone to help get rid of that excess potassium. In terms of acid-base balance, remember that all proteins have a very specific structure, and that allows them to perform a very specific function. You'll remember the primary chain of amino acids for the primary structure of a protein, which then either forms an alpha helix coil or a beta pleated sheet as a secondary structure, and then you've got a tertiary and a quaternary structure of proteins. Well, if the pH surrounding those proteins changes, it can cause them to denature or unravel or unfold, and they've lost that very specific structure for their very specific function. So pH affects all functional proteins and biochemical reactions, because remember, in plasma membranes we've got proteins that act as channels or pores or transport mechanisms or receptors. There are enzymes, some of which are purely proteins, some of which have a coenzyme or a cofactor. So pH has to be very tightly regulated by the body so that the proteins can maintain their specific shape to perform their specific function. The normal pH of body fluids that we've listed on this PowerPoint slide include the pH of arterial blood, which is normally at 7.45, the pH of venous blood and interstitial fluid, which normally measures at 7.35, and intracellular fluid is actually measured at a pH of 7.0. If the arterial pH rises above 7.45, that creates a condition known as alkalosis or alkalemia in the blood. If arterial pH falls below 7.35, that condition is known as acidosis or acidemia. And small amounts of acidic substances enter our body in food, but most of hydrogen ions are produced as a byproduct of metabolism. There are phosphorus-containing proteins that when they break down, they release phosphoric acid into the extracellular fluid. We know that lactic acid can form from anaerobic respiration of glucose. Fatty acids and ketone bodies can be formed from fat metabolism, and hydrogen ions are liberated when carbon dioxide is converted to bicarbonate in the blood. So this is the last slide in this first portion on fluid, electrolyte, and acid-base balance. We're going to move on to the next part.